Following is a taped interview with Mayor Paul Cooley of Muncie, Indiana, his office, the afternoon of March 28, 1969. Mayor Cooley, as you're probably aware, I'm writing a history of Local 287, UAW, as a doctoral dissertation for the Department of History at Ball State University. Now, it occurred to me that with a rich background and experience in the local movement, it's quite obvious that you can be of great assistance to me in my research. And you've been most helpful previously, and your cooperation is most commendable in this regard. Now, Paul, the first question I'd like to ask you is, when did you first go to work at Warner Gear? Approximately how many people were employed there at the time you went to work? And what was the status of the labor organization at the company when you became employed at Warner Gear?
Well, let's see, Dan. In 1935, October the 28th, I believe, was my date. And as nearly as I can recall, there were approximately 20 to 3,500 people working at that time. As you know, the overdrive was the big high production item that the company was manufacturing at that time, and it was really coming into its own. And they had just recently developed a new overdrive, which was popular on popular priced cars, as gas stations device. And they were making a lot of them and hiring a lot of people. As far as the status of the labor organization, I was about, I think, had just turned 21 at the time, and didn't know anything about it, really. But from conversations, a year or so later, I learned that there was an employee representative organization, commonly referred to as a company union. I think there had been efforts to organize the Warner Gear in 33 and 34 into the International Association of Machinists. And as you remember, Ralph Fisher, he was active in trying to organize the company.
Yes, I had a letter from Ralph last week.
Was that about all my questions?
Well, I think so, Paul. The next question sort of ties in with this one. The one I asked you was specifically relating to the Warner Gear local. I'd like to ask you also to recount for me, as nearly as you can from your memory, the general status of organized labor in the Muncie community during, let's say, the first half of the 1930s. For example, that very many workers in the Muncie area belonged to labor unions in the early 30s. Another question relating to this is, were wages generally high or comparatively low in the Muncie area compared to other cities of relative size throughout the Midwest or maybe the Northeast? And another question along the same line, what were the prevailing public attitudes in the early 1930s toward organizations of labor here in the Muncie community?
Well, as far as the early part of the 1930s, it was merely a question of survival, I think, for most people. The General Motors unit, known as the Muncie Products Division, had closed its doors sometime about 1930 or 31 and moved all the operation to Saginaw, Michigan. The Warner Corporation, who had employed as high as 1,400 people, I think, in 28 or 29, and manufactured transmissions and steering gears primarily, had closed their doors and moved to Syracuse, New York, to the new process manufacturing company. And now, I don't think any of the automotive plants, to my knowledge, had ever been organized. There were, of course, organizations in the skill trades, the bricklayers, the carpenters, the electricians, and the building trades council.
Well, wasn't there a local labor organization called, the Muncie Labor Union Center or some such collective organization that all these unions belong to?
Well, this was, of course, the Building Trade Council. They had an organization. I suppose they had a council of unions similar to the AFL Council at that time. The Central
Labor Union Council.
The Central Labor Council or something of the sort. But it wasn't very strong. In fact, a lot of people who were union-minded during the Depression, carpenters and people like this, I know from talking to them in later years, that they dropped their membership because they couldn't afford the dues.
Right.
And it was just simply a matter of, as I said before, survival and picking up a day's work where they could. But there had never been any organization in any of the plants. Now, you go back years prior, in the teens and from 1900 on, there were many, many unions in this town. The steel and iron workers, I think the iron cutlers were organized. All your glass workers were organized. And there were many, many glass factories in the town. And this was a very, very strong union. But I think in the early 30s, other than the 40th attempt at organizing the Warner Deere and some of the other plants, I don't think that anything ever came up.
Do you have any ideas as to how you could justify or explain or rationalize the lack of interest in labor unions among workers in the Muncie community, let's say from 1925 to 1934?
Oh, I think part of this would, you'd have to go back to the early 20s, the Palmer raid, the communist scare, which I suppose you could find some parallels and comparisons with the McCarthy era of the early 50s. And this and the fact that people were pretty prosperous up to 1930, and labor just simply wasn't as active. The concept of the industrial union just hadn't caught on. So they were never organized.
Well, this is probably a speculative question, but why were workers in the industrial plants in Muncie less ready to become organized, let's say, than comparable workers in Detroit or in Gary or in Anderson, for that matter?
Oh, I don't think they were less ready to become organized. I think Anderson, as an example, had this tremendous concentration of GM workers. And this thing all happened practically at the same time. You're speaking of the organization UAW.
Right.
They, Local 5 and Local 9 and some of these locals in the South End of Detroit were organized back right after the inception of the NRA, Section 7A of the NRA, which supposedly gave labor the right to organize and bargain collectively. And they got started as federal unions. And a lot of people don't realize that the auto workers in 1934 or early 1935 had around 200,000 members. And this simply, for the most part, just went by the board because they couldn't make it stick. They didn't have a strong international union. And you've read, I'm sure, some of the stories of the early organizational efforts in the automotive industry, where the AFL, as it existed at that time, just simply didn't have the machinery to handle an organization of this size and magnitude. And
I'm not sure the philosophy was congenial with the industrial organization.
Yeah, they didn't. I was going to say that they didn't want to. They were afraid that your industry, such as the auto and steel, would dominate the themselves as it was constituted then, and
designed to protect the interests of the skilled tradesmen.
The skilled tradesmen, and designed to protect the jobs of the people that held the hierarchy of the union as it was structured at that time.
You brought up the point that UAW was organized at Warner Gear. Let's go into that question. How and when did the workers at Warner Gear become members of the UAW?
Well, a group went to Anderson, and of course this came down to Detroit, the Anderson. The and they got started probably, a month or two before we did, and they sent an international representative for several possibly at one time or another with the Anderson. And several people at the Warner Gear, about February 1937, learned of this effort that was being made over there, and they went to Anderson and obtained some cards and brought them back and started the union in February of 37.
Paul, do you know who were some of these early members, and were they primarily local people, or were they? Was there really a local indigenous desire to organize a UAW local, or was this largely a stimulus that came from outside?
Oh, I would say it was all from within.
I see. The leadership was primarily
yes,
from within.
It was a local effort, and of course they needed guidance. But they had good, strong, responsible community, local people that were interested, such as Wilbur Kuntz, Ralph Fisher, Carl Parker, Harry Sweeney, George Patterson, Ralph Smith, many, Virgil Black, many people like this.
I see. Some of these people, I believe, the names sound familiar to me. Some of them I've met. Many of them, at least part of them, are probably still living in the community.
Well, of course, Virgil Black is still living in the community, and offhand, I suppose that he is possibly about the only one left.
I see. I know
the rest have either moved away, retired, moved away, or have died.
I see. Paul, looking at it from a personal point of view, now I know you told me earlier that you went to work at Warner Gear when you were quite young. Why and when did you become interested in the labor movement, philosophy of it, and the benefits that it might have for the factory worker? Why did you become a member of the early labor movement here in Muncie, and specifically at Warner Gear?
Well, I suppose you'd simply have to say this is where the action was in the idiom today. The labor movement was the biggest thing going. And I was young, and naturally I was motivated by a desire to advance and help myself along with my fellow worker as well. And I became interested and joined the union I think it was April or May of 1937, shortly after this initial effort was made back in February. And things were happening awfully fast at that time. I believe that we were probably, as the number would indicate, the first Muncie in the UAW, but you have to bear in mind that very, very soon afterwards, the Chevrolet, the Alpha Media Accurators, Muncie Gear, Warner Machine, and a lot of these other plants became organized the same summer, the same year.
Now, did you people, once you became organized, go over and help the people at Acme Lee, for example, Chevrolet?
Yes, it was, you had a very, very fraternal feeling, and we're all in the same boat.
Well, let me go back
together.
and ask a question that I think I asked earlier, and along with several others I threw out at one time. What kind of attitude did you encounter on the part, for example, of the man who holds your position now, the mayor of the city, and the local police, and the local officials in general? Was there a harmonious, congenial, sympathetic attitude on the part of local political authorities toward the labor movement? Or was there indifference, or was there hostility? What was the relationship?
Well, I would say that there was a very, very sympathetic cooperation. By at least the summer of 1937, there might have been some differences of opinion, and earlier, 6 or 8 months earlier. But you have to bear in mind that the labor movement by this time was like a dam that had burst and caused the Johnstown flood. It was just simply engulfing the whole country, and it was moving so rapidly that history was being made every day, and you just simply couldn't keep up with it. But I think that the people in public office, like the mayor and the chief of police, and of course the chief of police carried out the policies that more or less, you might say, the mayor, realized that this movement was here to stay, and there was much sympathy for it, and it was a big, powerful, potentially powerful movement, and they tried to help us.
Very fine. Now, Paul, I was wondering also, what were the attitudes of the local media of communication at the time? For example, the radio stations and the newspapers, and, well, also, for example, the churches.
Well, I think the attitude of the church then and now was entirely different. One particular denomination, which I won't name on the tape, was a rock-ribbed, rock-bound conservative church, and today it's an entirely different thing. I recall a strike that we had in 1939 where they thought that people hadn't been represented or the ballots hadn't been counted properly with regard to a strike that we had, the second one in October of 1939, which is 2 years later than the initial period that we're talking about.
Right.
They raised questions and tried to enlist citizens groups. And you know, the newspaper and the news media, they might possibly try to reflect the ideas and philosophy of their advertisers or owners. But your merchants and people who advertise, I think, quickly realized that after we had been recognized and had our initial success, that we were a factor to be considered and dealt with, and then you have to consider that we had this strong fraternal feeling and rapport with one another, and we weren't above not patronizing someone who we considered unfair to organized labor. In this respect, then, we were possibly a lot stronger than we are today.
Quite interesting. Paul, I wonder if you remember any of the editorials in the local newspapers. Were they, in general, inclined to encourage or to discourage or to remain relatively aloof of the labor movement in the community?
Dan, if I had to say, I probably read the newspapers today a lot more carefully than I did then. I would suggest to decide, go to the library. They have all the newspapers on microfilm.
I've done that.
You've done that. Well, okay. Okay, well, that's all right. You're not going to play this for anybody but yourself, are you?
It's going to be in the library, yes.
It is. Well, that's all right.
No, that's all right. I didn't.
Oh, I understand.
That's all right. Now, another question I'd like to ask you, Mr. Mayor. What official positions have you held within the local union at Warner Gear? I know that you've had several. You've been a constant supporter of the organization, whether you held an office or not. What have been some of the official offices that you have held as a member of the local?
Well, I suppose the union to me is probably an outlet. And I grabbed hold of the handle, I suppose you might say, pretty early, and was a steward first, and then served as financial secretary, and president, treasurer, committeeman. Well, I guess that's about all of the offices which is mixed on. And this would cover a period of possibly 15 years.
Right.
And been delegate to different conventions and councils.
What years were you president of the local?
1 year, and this was 1942.
to 43.
Yes.
Who published it? Do you remember?
Ben Weeks.
Right. Now, I think it'd be helpful to me in my research, Mr. Mayor, if you could just sort of begin with the beginning, from your memory of the landmarks in the organization, and try to recount what would seem to you to be the highlights or the major landmarks in the development of the local union during the past, well, since 1937.
Well, I suppose you would have to say, when the union first started, as I say, we brought back about 30 cars from Anderson, and those were signed quickly, and in fact, they couldn't get the cards in fast enough. The first great thing that was on everyone's mind, when are we going to get the charter? When is the charter going to get here? Well, finally we received the charter from the International Union. And then we had an election that was conducted by the Labor Board, and we were certified as the sole bargaining agent for the productive employees.
Do you remember when that was?
Well, this was, as I recall, sometime in June or July of 37. And, of course, after we were certified as a sole bargaining agent, we started our negotiations with the company and were able to obtain our first contract with recognition and establish the principle of seniority, the pay rates, and all the other things that really make up the contract in August or September of 1937. And things went along pretty well until we had our first strike in 1939. And we had a 3-week strike and were very successful in getting most of our demands met as a result of this strike with the company. And then we, in October, this was, as I recall, in the middle of August of 39. Then in October 39, we had a 4-week strike over, more or less, you might say, whether or not we should have a national agreement throughout Fort Warner with, at that time, the Detroit Gear and Morris Chain, various other locals, part of the Fort Warner chain. And this didn't come out so well. And we had just gone through a period of a lot of unemployment during the whole year of 1938. Times were very, very bad. In fact, I expect the employment at the Warner Gear was lower than it had been at any time during the Depression.
Oh, really? In 38, yes. It was lower than it was maybe in 33 or 34.
Oh, yes. So, whether or not this was an attempt by the company to cut back and try to beat the organization, I don't know. But I don't think that there's been any serious effort, if indeed that was an effort on the part of the company at that time to do this. I don't think there's been a serious effort since to accomplish anything like this. And I suppose our...
You think in general, then, that the company recognized the union was something here to stay and it's effective?
Here to stay, that's right.
About 1930?
Well, I would say by the latter part of 39 or 40 along there.
But during the first 2 or 3 years, you think the company still wondered whether or not it was a permanent organization?
This is true. I think this is true. Now, we can go on and talk about the various strikes we've had. I think perhaps, and we would have to share this with the employees of Ford Motor Company who established the principle of the pension in the first place.
Right.
But the pension principle was first established, as I recall, back in 1950. Along at this period of time, somewhere in 1950, and then, of course, we were constantly improved. The principle of, I suppose you would say, guaranteed annual wages as guaranteed by supplemental unemployment benefits, which was established 4 or 5 years later. And I think these would probably be the milestones. because they're more lasting benefits.
Well, now this may very well be, but you've stopped listing major landmarks about 1950. Is this suggestive of the fact that maybe we haven't been making major advances since 1950 in the labor movement here in the area, do you think, especially in UAW?
Well, I think we've made major advances. I don't know whether we've improved our relative position as far as wages are concerned, because you know the inflationary picture as well as I do. The people in UAW who have gone a long way to establishing the cost of living escalator on wages, you'd have to call this a landmark, because well, it protects the man's wages when the cost of living goes up.
Paul, how about building the home of the local labor?
This is a symbolic.
I can remember as a very young man myself, hearing you and Jack Reed and some other of the old timers stand up in the Labor Center at the time was in the Benetton building down on South Walnut and make long and ardent speeches in favor of some sort of a home for the local labor movement. And after being away from Muncie for something in excess of a dozen years, I come back and find one.
Well, wasn't this built before you left?
If it was when I was not active in the labor movement. Probably, when was it built, you know?
Well, I think they moved in 53 or 54.
Well, I was in college full time at that time, probably.
Yes. But I suppose, yes, you would say this would be a landmark in the organization, at least in the minds of the people, because this gives them something tangible to identify with.
I see.
As far as the organization's concerned, I don't know if it's really any great value. Now, the fact that I think the union has branched out in other directions, as evidenced by the fact that they bought around a 40-acre park, which they established for their membership out at the edge of town, with swimming and boating and, well, I don't know about the boating, but at least swimming and fishing facilities, picnicking, and a place where the members can go and their families. And I think that I know that the International Union has tried to encourage the membership to become more active and identify themselves with community affairs, that they realize that, after all, to have a successful organization, you have to be a community, public-spirited, motivated type of organization. There's a limit to how many raises you can get for employees, and you have recognition, and you police the contract on a daily basis in the plant, and you have to come down to where you give service to the whole community, or you don't have any reason to exist.
This leads me to a couple of philosophic questions I had in mind to ask you anyway, and this is probably as good a time as any. What tangible, or intangible, for that matter, benefits does a factory worker gain from belonging to a labor union such as the UAW at Warner Gear?
Well, I think, I would have to say actually that it lays down the rules and it wraps everything up nice and tight, and everyone knows where they are, mainly.
Mm-hmm.
And it ensures that a man has a voice and can be heard and be represented and have his side of the story told. I don't think, really, if you would go out and ask the present manager of the Warner Gear or the previous manager of the Warner Gear if the company ever knowingly tried to be unfair, I'm sure they would deny this. But I'm sure that they would also admit that somewhere along the line, or down the line, some of their supervisors might have been unfair and paid, and, not operate in a manner that was even company policy. So I would say for this reason that it gives the man who belongs, who works in the factory, who works with his hands, a certain amount of dignity. He has a sense of belonging. He can hold his head up high because he has a powerful organization representing. And for this reason alone, I would say it's a fact.
Well, very fine. Now, do you think that the young people going into the factories now, in the 1960s, are as much aware and as conscious of this paternalism that you emphasized as a leading factor in your becoming a member of the organization as you were and as the people were a generation or so earlier than now?
No, I don't think there's any comparison. It all goes back, and I don't want to be corny, the old saying, you know, I think it's in the scripture someplace, you're made perfect by the things you suffer. And the young person today going into the factory that steps into all the conditions and benefits and wage structure that he has handed to him, that he really hasn't had to earn. Naturally, he don't appreciate as much as I did because I had to struggle for it. And I had a reason to join the union and work hard and try to improve things because I was down at the lowest end of the scale.
Yes. Well, this leads to another question, and that is that it's generally agreed, Paul, among historians, that at least one of the basic appeals of labor unions to workers in the United States has been, historically, the ability of organized workers to gain a larger share of the fruits of their own production. Now, it seems to me that presently, industrial workers have largely been elevated to what we might call a middle-class economic status. And I think you mentioned this earlier in our discussion.
Right.
Now, my question is, will labor unions still continue to have a reasonably strong appeal to workers? Or will labor unions have to change their basic goals or their method of operation?
Well, I think they have changed their method of operations. I said a while ago that they are getting more into community efforts and efforts for in behalf of the poor and disadvantaged segment of society as a whole. And they're going to have to certainly change with the times as the church has changed with the times. And is going to have to change with the times if they survive. Their reason for being, I think there's still a reason. The reasons may have changed. I think they have. But as long as everything is kept in balance, why, I believe that they're needed in this country. And, of course, you have to realize that in this country, many of the things that are gained by union contract are a matter of national law in foreign countries.
Paul, a question that occurred to me, suggested by something said by Dr. Menez earlier. We have a much more open society, greater opportunities for working class young men to work themselves up through education, through training and professional schools and so forth, and to advance their own status in society, to go into the professions and the service areas. Now, is this going to be a drain on the what we might call the brain supply of the leadership and labor organizations? Or are you going to have more and more of the people like Walter Reuther going out of labor organizations and becoming parts of the establishment, as it were, and being basically content and not carrying on a crusade for social and economic improvement in our society? Do you see this as any kind of a problem or a threat to the future of organized labor?
No, I think there will always be certain people who will be motivated in this direction, and because they like it. It's fascinating to them. They're just so constituted. This is the line that they'll take.
Well, very fine. Mr. Mayor, do you have any further comments that occur to you that might be helpful to me in my research for the paper?
I'm sorry that I didn't save all the papers and old grievances and this type thing, but I just didn't. My wife says I saved too many things.
Well, Paul, I think most students, such as myself of history, understand this completely, because if you do much research at all, you find that Americans just don't, by and large, save things, except New Englanders. New Englanders usually save the first shoestring they had.
Right.
But when you get into the Midwest, the Southerners are the worst people in the world. They save nothing. So it's very difficult to find material. However, several people have called me and indicated that they do have various bits of information. Ben Weeks, for example, sent me an entire briefcase of grievances and letters of correspondence that he had had as president. And George Stevenson called last week and told me that he had contracts between the local and the Warner Company going all the way back to 1938, which would include all except the first one.
Right.
So the material is coming in, and I suppose the only thing left that I should ask you is, do you have any suggestions as to other sources for additional material that I might find, other contacts that I might be able to make to gain leads as to where I might find material that would be helpful to me in developing a reasonably accurate reconstruction of the history of the local?
No, I don't. I would talk to Jack Reed. He could take you back.
Someone told me that Jack at one time started to write a history of the local.
I think so.
I see. So. You know how long this has been? How far he got or anything?
I don't know how far he got. It's been at least 10 or 15 years since he talked about doing this.
I see. Now, was Jack active in the local back in the 1930s?
Oh, yes. He was active from, sometime in 37 on, I would say.
Jack was
extremely active.
President at one
39,
time?
Yes. He was president several years.
I see.
At different times.
And I know he helped organize some of the other locals in the 40s and 50s, because I remember seeing Jack Reed around when I didn't even know who he was.
Yes. He was, I think, chairman of the organizing committee of the council.
Wasn't he also active politically in the local Democratic Party organization?
Yes.
I see.
However, Jack changed sides in 1940.
I didn't know that.
He used to be a Republican committee.
Well, this is interesting. His brother, I knew, was a Republican, Lou.
Well, yes, and he had another
But
brother,
Jack was a red-hot Democrat.
But his other brother, Opie, was the active Democrat.
Yes. How about Walter Classical? How far back does he go?
Well, he goes back to the beginnings of Local 287. And he was a president at one time of 287.
Walter was active in politics also, am I right on that?
Yes, and he was a Republican.
Right.
He turned Democrat also.
When did he turn Democrat?
Oh, golly, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he served a term in the state legislature as a Republican.
That's right, as a Republican.
And then he changed.
As a matter of fact, he defeated Jack Reed, I believe.
Yeah, he changed and afterwards became a Democrat and ran as a Democrat.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Now, is this typical then? Do we have many of the labor leaders coming from former Republican ranks who were beginning to move toward the Democrats because of their identification with the labor movement and the identification of labor with maybe the New Deal or the Democratic Party?
I believe so. Actually, many of the old line AFL now, Jack Reed was a former building trades union member.
I see.
Walter Classical was a former glassworker member. And if you would research into their background, you would find that Bill Green, who was president of the AFL, was a Republican.
That's right.
A strong Republican.
Right.
And John L. Lewis had been a Republican until Roosevelt came along. And then he endorsed Wendell Willkie
in 1940. Right, I remember that.
So,
and Gompers was almost consistently opposed to taking a public position on politics
That's
at
right.
all, because he
That's
thought
right.
the labor movement ought not to become involved because it would be a threat
Directly
to
with
its...
any party.
Right. Although I think in 32, AFL endorsed Roosevelt. I may be wrong on that.
I'm not sure.
In 36 they did not, I remember, but I think 32 they did. I'm not positive. Well, this is quite interesting, and I can see where it's going to be quite an interesting adventure to work with these people in the community, and let me say that I'm most appreciative of your willingness to take the time out, Paul, to talk with me. It's not only a pleasure, but also a great professional help. And I won't take any more of your time.
Well, that's very good, Dan. Most happy to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.